Oke, kita akan mulai sesi GAMESEED training hari ini. Dan sesi GAMESEED training hari ini kita bakal bareng sama speaker kita dan Pantumsinchai dari Google. Oke, biar nggak lama-lama, biar kita bisa langsung belajar banyak sama Dan. Langsung aja, Pak oper ke Kang Wafi selaku moderator.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, thank you, Job, and thank you, Dan, for having to come to the session. But I will give a bit of opening in Indonesia, right? So if you excuse me, ya. Yeah. Oke. So thank you juga buat teman-teman yang udah datang. Jadi ini mungkin sambil nunggu teman-teman yang telat datang ya. Tapi kita tetap akan mulai tepat waktu karena kita bakal menghargai orang-orang yang udah datang tepat waktu. Jangan ngepanis mereka, gitu kan ya. Nah. Jadi mungkin ini kalau kemarin kita udah ngebahas tentang analytics, metric analytics, terus habis itu juga tentang user acquisition. Nah, sebenarnya harusnya sesi setelahnya ini adalah yang terjadi di hari Kamis ya. Tapi karena kita juga ketika ngatur schedule ini harus mengikuti waktu dari speaker, jadi ini agak dipending. Sebenarnya itu harusnya sesinya di sesi satu step setelahnya ya. Jadi hari ini setelah kita kemarin ngebahas tentang analytics, metric, lalu kita ngebahas tentang jualan pakai iklan gitu ya, pakai user acquisition. Nanti hari Kamis akan ada tentang creative ads. Nah, nextnya kita akan ngebahas tentang monetization. Akan ada dua, yaitu tentang in-app purchase yang hari ini sama di besok, di minggu depan ya, yang tentang ads, revenue dari ads. Nah, mungkin buat teman-teman ada yang udah implement monetization, ada yang belum. Kalau yang udah implement harusnya bisa langsung pakai ilmunya. Kalau yang belum, jadi patokan buat sebelum desain. Jadi semoga teman-teman bisa dapetin dari sesi ini banyak ilmu tentang gimana cara desain monetization yang oke gitu ya. Kalau kayak gitu ya. Oke. Sip. Welcome Dan to the GAMESEED training, and thank you for your time. Yeah. Our goal today is like to help the team. We are in the incubation phase, so we have 20 teams here who they have a prototype and they are about to release the early access feature on the Google Play, and then they will also implement the monetization. So the intention is for the session today to help them design how to create in-app purchase that give them optimized revenue. Okay. I think the stage is yours. You are free to share the session.
Great. Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for having me. Let me just share my screen and then we can get started. So can you see this?
Yes, cool. We can see it.
Yeah, all good? Okay. Let me just oops. All right, yeah, so as I mentioned, name is Dan Pantumsinchai. I'm a strategic partnerships development manager at Google Play, based in Singapore. So today I'll be talking to you about how to optimize revenue for your in-app purchases. So before we start, I want to share that, you can please be on mute because we have a lot of people on the call. Please don't record the video by yourself. I know that we're recording this session on our end, so don't need to do that on yours. And then please also do not share on social networks because this information is proprietary and confidential to Google and Google Play. Cool. So first, before we dive into the actual monetization optimization, I think first we need to talk about player motivation. And the reason of this is because when it comes to optimizing any kind of revenue for your game, we need to understand why players are playing our games. And for that, we should take a look at the underlying motivations first. As the very first base before we design anything monetization. So why do people play mobile games? So, mobile gaming is just one subsection of larger gaming. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with console and PC games. And then, with the different types of gaming, you can see here on the screen, gamer motivation models. Some players want action, some players want social, some players want mastery, achievement, immersion, creativity, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of reasons why players play play games, but for mobile games on top of that, we also need to consider the where am I playing this, the environmental context, and also passing time to avoid boredom. Because a lot of people play mobile games because they have 5 minutes here or there while they're waiting for a bus or a coffee shop, things like that. So it's really important to really keep in mind that as you design your mobile games, that you're not only trying to design for the primary game motivations here, but then also taking into account the unique aspects of mobile games as well. And why is this important to game design? Well, that's because game design is intrinsically linked to monetization design. So the reasons why someone enjoys a game will impact both how you design it and what you can monetize from it. And these things are highly correlated and will impact each other. Why people play a game tells us what value in the game. So understanding what's important to players helps us determine what we can monetize. We can then decide what business model works best. And once we know that, we can make sure that the design incorporates the appropriate monetization and business models as well. So it goes in a loop like this. Obviously, we'll be talking about IAP specifically today, but it's good to keep this larger framework in mind, as there's also different types of monetization, as you know, such as ads or premium games and so forth and so forth. All right, so let's talk about just a casual genre, just to kind of crystallize some of these concepts. So for example, for a match 3 style game, what will or why does someone enjoy this game? So clearly these games cater to players who care about progression and challenge. You complete levels, it's challenging, you try to figure out how to clear. There's a level of competition as well, perhaps with leaderboards and things like that, but it's probably not the primary motivation. And there may be also motivations besides that, such as story, narrative, and world, which have been more recent success with kind of match and builder hybrid type games. So when we apply this to the value map that we looked at earlier, it's clear that players have motivation around progression and challenge, and that comes from completing levels and overcoming difficult levels. So that's the player value here. How do you monetize that? Well, what we do is for a lot of match 3 games is they actually monetize the completion of levels by allowing for more moves, for breaking up tiles, things like that, and as well as extending playtime with things like lives. And then the way that they actually implement that in the game can be done with either IAP or ads, like buy an item to get more lives or watch an ad to get more lives, that kind of thing. And then in that, in turn, will then go back and reinforce or affect how the design plays into the ultimate game when the designer creates new levels or balances the difficulty of levels. So you can see it starts from the motivation, but it translates to player value, the monetization of that value, the way we implement it into the game, the how, and then how it goes back and affects future design. So we always want to keep this loop in mind when we're designing monetization for our titles. So, to sum up this quick first section, so what we really want to do when we build games is to build fun and entertaining experiences. And the way to do that is to really understand the motivations of your players. So I understand all of you have games in development. Hopefully you understand who you're building your game for and then what motivations you're serving. That will ensure that you design the right experience for the right audience. And it's important to note that, games can have many different kinds of motivations, and they can be, not really, or I should say, they're not totally just like a single motivation for one player in the game. They might have several different motivations, and those motivations might change over time as well. So it's always good to keep track of what your player base is doing. And then finally, just want to leave another note is that you're not always building a game for yourself, and the people who are ultimately going to be playing your game might have different motivations than yourself. Okay, so that kind of wraps up this first section. So just some food for thought. Are you serving the motivations of all your players when you're designing your game? Make sure you identify those motivations early on. Revisit how you serve those motivations, because it will it will affect how you create your roadmap, how you balance your game, and how you create content and ultimately monetize your game as well. So once we get past motivations, you can go on to the next section. We talk a little bit about game loops. So I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with what this is, but just to kind of go over it quickly. So what is a core game loop? The core game loop is a set of actions that player will be doing over and over. And again, when designing mobile games through loops, it's critical to do it with player motivations in mind. So what does a core game loop look like? So for a slots game, the core game loop is simply spinning the slot and seeing the result, and then you continue the loop. You just keep spinning, and that's the core game loop. The fun in the core game loop comes from the anticipation of the results, which is both the immersion and the excitement. Therefore, it becomes very important to distribute the outcomes, and then so that you're able to let players enter that and stay in that state of flow where they're really enjoying what's happening. Core game loops can also evolve with different meta loops. So in different kind of slots games, some developers have added progression loops for slots games. So the more you spin, the faster you progress, the higher level you get. This helps tap into achievement motivations by making progression part of the game loop. And this is just one example of how you can layer additional loops onto your game. And then, eventually what we want to do is monetize the loops as well. So that's where we bring in the monetization aspect. When we take a look at a game like a battle royale, the game loop outside the battle game is very simple. So you battle and then you win or die. How well you do determines how fast you progress to the next tier. However, in the battle itself, there's also a core game loop, which fulfills the motivation. But the monetization actually happens outside of the game. So in the actual game, what you're doing is you're starting a battle, trying to find guns, searching for loot, getting to the skirmishes, and then you either win or die and you repeat. So, battle royale games don't tend to monetize the actual gameplay, but they monetize the outside kind of layered on loops that happen that don't happen during the battle. So what you need to understand is that the core game loop is only the beginning of when you're designing the game and thinking about monetization. You can have a single loop. You can bring in additional complexity by laying on other loops on top of the core loop. For example, in like the mid game, you could introduce some kind of quest system or achievement system, which is another vector and motivation for players to keep playing. There are other things like meta loops where once players master the mid game, they're introduced to an end game, and there's often a dominant strategy which appears and things like that, and that's where kind of rare collectibles and character completion RPGs appear, or diamond leagues or higher tiers in competitive games. So it's important that you can have several loops in your game, but the design gives players some agency of choice. They can choose how they want to engage in the game and settle where they feel most comfortable. And in games that are pay to progress or pay to win, the meta loop is not often accessible to everybody. So free-to-play players might stay at the first loop, while players who pay in advance and become more heavy spenders might enter like the meta loop phase. So the point is that each loop layers on more complexity and introduces new goals to the master. So the new goals usually appeal to different player motivations. And then there's also things which you can layer on, which are non-gameplay loops. So social loops, friends, guild versus guild, esports loops, marketing loops. So basically, we're just trying to make the game have as many different entryways and ways for players to engage and feel like that they can drive engagement through social activity and things like that, just to make it more sticky. This will help ultimately with monetization, because the more that your players are engaged, the more likely they are to spend and then become long-term advocates for your title. So just wrapping up this second section. So be sure to map out your core game loop. When you look at your game, how have the key actions in the core game loop evolved since your game launched, or the games that you've been developing have started in development? And think about what other game loops you can layer on to the game to appeal to additional motivations and ultimately revenue later down the line. So now that we've covered the first motivations and next core game loop, let's talk a little bit about the basics of game economy design. And specifically, how to design an economy that is sustainable and will be beneficial for both you and your players. So the first thing to think about when you think about designing a game economy is the assets. So in-game items are assets are basically in-game items which are utilized to progress through the core game loop or the meta game loop. And there are 4 types of common assets that can be found in games. So one is energy, the second is currency, third is resources, and the fourth is troops. So I'm sure if you guys have played mobile games before, some of this will sound very familiar. But essentially what we need to think about when designing the economy is how assets are linked to in-game asset or in-game actions. So this is an example of what the interaction would look like. So a player consumes the assets during the core gameplay loop. and they're rewarded with some kind of reward, which then flows back to them. So you can think of them as, yeah, basically consuming assets during gameplay and then getting something back. So, for example, if they consume stamina to then play a level, but then at the end of the level, they obtain gold, something like that, right? So gold will flow back to them. So this is like the most simple way to explain it, but basically the economy is the movement of these assets within the game. Players are spending some resource and getting some resource back. But really what you want to make sure when you design your in-game economy is that the amount of assets that the player earns is less than the amount that the player spends. So basically, the worst thing that can happen is that you design a game from a monetization standpoint where the players always have enough resources to do whatever they want. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is entice the player to eventually become spenders and engage in the game in that way. And a lot of our games that we're releasing are free to play. So there are always going to be some kind of hook that gets them into the game and they can start playing. But until they become spenders, then it's not really achieving our ultimate goal. So what you want to do is make sure that whatever kind of resource or system that you have in your game, that ultimately players at some point feel the need to spend in order to make up for the gap between the amount of assets that they gain and the amount of assets that they spend through the gameplay loop. So there are other ways that you can think about this when it comes to the player's assets. So we talked about the right side where players are spending, let's say, stamina through the gameplay, earning back gold and resources to come back to their wallet. There are other things that you can do as well for non-gameplay assets. And this is where the paid component, the revenue, can come in. But for example, non-gameplay asset outflows could be things like character acquisition, level ups, upgrade, which is like the red arrow in the top left. Non-gameplay asset inflows, so the free arrow here, could be things like login bonus, friend perks, achievements, basically stuff that provide resources to the player but are not related to actual gameplay. And then obviously the paid inflow of assets are things that, additional stamina or additional gems or currency, anything that basically the player pays for, which then can be converted back into the gameplay. This is how you should think about the loop of your in-game economy. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of the in-game economy. So I think for this section, what you really want to think about is how can you link your core game loop to the in-game assets and then the player wallet. So when thinking about the core game loop in your title, think through where the majority of your in-game assets are consumed. And this is all types of assets. Is it where you currently expect it to be, or are there adjustments that you could make to tweak the amount of assets going back to the player and potentially entice them to spend at different moments when they realize they don't have enough to continue the game loop? Excuse me. So moving on to the next section. So we've gone through the basics of the motivation, so why people play games, how that impacts game design, which is the core game loop, and then also kind of basics around economy design. So now let's dig into how to link these to KPIs and then also to monitor the performance of your game. So KPIs. So what are KPIs? So KPIs are key performance indicators. These are quantifiable measures used to evaluate the success of an organization, product, or employee. And we use them when we also take a look at how our games are performing. It's basically answering the question, what should I monitor to understand how my game is performing? So some common KPIs to monitor. There are core KPIs, engagement KPIs, and also economy KPIs. So you should think about common KPIs to monitor as kind of a funnel. You have your top level KPIs. And then as you go further down the funnel, you're using engagement and economy KPIs, which are specific to your game, to better understand the drivers for directional change in the core KPIs. So what are these and what can they be used for? So today we'll be talking mainly about the core KPIs. So these are basically game agnostic, industry standard KPIs that games are always monitoring. KPIs are useful for the entire studio. So that goes for GMs, PMs, analysts. Anyone can use this data to understand how the overall business performance of the game is going about. So using it to understand business trends or identify any opportunities through benchmarking is a common use case for these KPIs. So let's take a look at the core KPI tree. So it looks like something like this. So because we're focused on revenue for this session, I just wanted to share kind of the core KPIs for the revenue tree. So the top level core KPI or funnel we're creating a report of. So the way you would read this is every metric has a parent. If two metrics have the same parent, you multiply them together to get the parent value. So for example, if I wanted to figure out the daily revenue in my game, I would take the daily active users, or shortened to DAU, and multiply it by the average revenue per daily active user, which is shortened to ARPDAU here. So these two things multiplied together will get you the daily revenue. And then further down the tree, the same thing applies. So if I wanted to know how many daily active users I had, I would multiply the number of new installs by the number of returning, or sorry, I would add the number of new installs and the number of returning users, and then that would give you my daily active users. So anything that's a dotted line, you add together, and anything else you would multiply to get the top parent result. So in looking at average revenue per daily active user, you would basically multiply the daily conversion rate and the average revenue per paying user, or ARPU. And then these two things multiplied together would give you the average revenue per daily user. So it's important to understand three things when looking at this KPI tree. First is how the game developer is topping off the funnel in terms of getting new installs, specifically by source. So are your new installs coming in through organic sources or paid sources? Two, how well the game is retaining those users. So in terms of retention, looking at the daily retention and also the installed cohort size. And then three, we have to look at how well the game monetizes the users. So the left side is all about users, and the right side is all about how well you monetize those users once they get your game. So we've been working and sharing more broadly to developers the concept of primary and secondary monetization metrics. You can see here. So primary monetization metrics, which is highlighted on the right side, is basically how well you're monetizing your game across the entire user base. So how well are you converting your users into new buyers and making those new buyers become repeat buyers? The secondary monetization metrics, which is on the right side, also highlighted, is how much you're able to get out of your paying user base. So the average transaction value, the number of transactions per buyer, and that will tell you how much average revenue your paying users are. And then it's worth noting that the secondary monetization group of players is usually going to be much smaller. And we usually see less than 10% of players in a free-to-play game actually pay for games that they download and install. So this is basically the key performance indicators or KPIs you should be looking at when designing and monetizing your player base. So to wrap up the fourth section, are you tracking all the KPIs you need? As I mentioned, there are other KPIs related to engagement and also game economy as well. But in terms of revenue KPIs, looking at the daily active users and then the average revenue per daily active user, figuring out your daily revenue numbers, all those kind of things, primary and secondary monetization metrics are really important to make sure that your game is healthy and that you're actually converting users to being paid after they played your game for free for a while. The next section, we talk a little bit about monitoring KPIs. So with any kind of KPI, what we always recommend is that you have an easily accessible dashboard with all your core and key engagement KPIs. So we covered a ton of metrics, but it's important for reporting that you keep an eye on kind of daily KPIs. So this could be, if you can create this dashboard, it can be a one-stop shop for every stakeholder to understand your general game performance. And the kind of dashboard is generally one that even our internal teams and analyst teams will check first when we want to understand what's happening in any kind of game in the market. This should be easily digestible for both employees who are working on the game on a day-to-day, but then also at a higher level, such as GMs or VPs of your company, to really understand the business performance that's happening. So the dashboard should include a long-term view, and we usually recommend taking at least a 3 to 6 month view of all core KPIs, and usually on a daily level with monthly average for core metrics. So you should also include key engagement and participation metrics. And it's also good to break out metrics by more common dimensions, such as platform. Are you releasing just on one platform or multiple platforms? By geography, is your game releasing in just one market or several markets? And then you can also segment your dashboards by player segments. So looking at only players who spend or only free-to-play players, and that will allow you to find patterns of different kind of segments of your player base as well. So that's the 5th section. So keep in mind, how are you tracking all of your KPIs? What kind of dashboards and views are you using? Can you segment the different dashboards and look and slice the data in different ways? What kind of insights can you draw from them? And can you track your KPIs more granularly to inform them of your game performance? So the next section I want to talk about is mobile gaming monetization models. So some common types of monetization models, this session obviously is more focused on IAP, but there is other types of monetization, as we mentioned as well, premium, subscriptions, as well as ads. Each has their own pros and cons, but for the majority of mobile games, we find that in-app purchases do have the most potential for making revenue. So some key considerations for IAP games, and of course, is acquisition is still key, but there's a lot more attention paid to engagement and monetization, because the longer a user is engaged, the more likely they are to pay. So for engagement, there are such considerations as, does your game have enough gameplay to sustain a high number of days played? And are there reasons for users to keep coming back into the product? So for games that are hyper casual or only focused on getting players to play a little bit, a lot of those find success with ads monetization, because there's not a lot of depth to the game. They're really easy to pick up and play. Players maybe play for a minute or two a day and maybe come back once a week or once a month, things like that. With those kind of really hyper casual games, we find that those tend to be ad monetized, because as I mentioned, there just isn't enough content for players to feel really engagement and then eventually convert into purchase. But for games that are trying to implement IAP, we really highly recommend that you have enough content to keep players engaged, because once they're engaged, they'll be more likely to spend. But to do that, you need to have enough gameplay elements and enough reasons for them to keep coming back and playing your game. So on the monetization side, whoops, sorry, let me go back. Is there a wide range of, okay, sorry, looks like my mouse is a little strange. Basically, on the monetization side, are there plenty of options for players to purchase that span their different willingness to pay? Some players only want to spend a small amount of money every now and then, while some players want to spend a lot of money to get ahead. So are you offering enough types of IAPs in your store that can really appeal to different types of buyers? And then also, does the product have depth and breadth in monetization? Do you have enough of the motivations monetized? And does each product have a depth of investment in each monetization? So at the very beginning, we talked about motivations of players, core game loops, and things like that. Do you have enough ways that you're monetizing those loops and getting money out of players in different types of ways? Because as we know, Players play games for different reasons. So making sure that your game also supports monetization for those different motivations is really important. So a good rule of thumb is to ask yourself the question, can this game sustain 10,000 hours of play? And can a user spend $10,000 and feel happy about doing it? So obviously for Indonesia, those numbers might be different. But really, you should ask yourself, is this the type of game that someone can really, really invest a lot of time in, and at the same time invest a lot of money in? Yeah, wide willingness of play, and yeah. So some food for thought, integrate multiple monetization models. So when thinking about other monetization models within your game, you can think through key considerations and specific features in your game instead of the app. So this session is mainly about IAPs, but that being said, there isn't anything stopping you from having both types of monetization. You could have ads as well as IAP, as well as subscriptions. It's really up to you what you feel like works best for your game and how you want to monetize. And then, yeah, that's mainly what I wanted to talk about today. So just to wrap up, so make sure that you identify key player motivations and monetization moments by mapping core game loop using flow diagrams. Track your core engagement and monetization KPIs and understand the relationship between KPI trees. And also monitor your key asset sources and sinks using dashboards. If you want to learn more, feel free to visit Google Play Academy. You can scan the QR code here, which will take you to our learning site. This learning path is you optimize and grow your games. There are even more deeper learnings on player motivations, game design, in-game economy, and deeper dives on the metrics and KPIs, including some of what I covered today. So this will really help you design the best monetization strategy for your games based on your understanding of your users' motivations and your core game loop. And that wraps up my session.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I think this is really very true learning material for everyone. Hopefully, everyone can understand. Yeah, I have a question, and then for everyone who want to ask, you can ask to the chat or you can raise hand. Maybe Calvin, go ahead.
Okay, since this lecture is about optimizing revenue, one of the source of the revenue is from the app, as you might already know, of course. And sometimes indie developer especially, they put ads like too much, like when the players are playing, the player die, even maybe when the player still in the game. So how do you have some kind of data formula, like what is the best period to put ad like between the playing session? It is like on like every 10 minutes, every 5 minutes, every 15 minutes. What is your opinion? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Honestly, it really does depend on the game. With ads, I mean, they can be very alluring because it's easy, right? It's really easy to understand. Like players watch an ad and you get some amount of money. But what we really want to achieve with IAPs is that long-term engagement. So players are less likely to stick with the game if it has a lot of ads. That's definitely true. So what we really recommend is that you establish the value for your game with the player before really trying to hammer them with ads, which are clearly just trying to monetize them. I think players understand that ads can be like a necessary evil for free to play, you know, in some way. But not every player is looking to engage with ads before they even know why the game is fun or why they should be investing their time. So if you're looking to monetize with IAPs as like a main strategy for your title, I would say that allowing the player to experience your core game loop at least once or maybe a few times before serving them ads is probably a good strategy, because if a player downloads your game for the first time and before they even start a level, they're served an ad, that's probably not a good experience. They probably won't want to continue, maybe have like a high level of drop off. But at least if they're able to complete a level or tutorial and really understand the value that you're trying to present to them, then maybe it's not such a bad idea to show them an ad and things like that. The other thing that we see some developers doing is really giving more agency to the players. So instead of showing a mandatory ad for players at the end of a level, let's say, I've seen some developers who basically give the player a choice. So in the middle of the level, they put like a save point, and they say like, if you want to save your game in the middle of the stage, you can trigger this ad and watch an ad and save your game. So it's up to the player, right? If the player thinks there's benefit for saving their game in the middle of the level, then they have the option to watch the ad if they want. But if they don't want to, then they don't need to. So I think that kind of thinking in terms of also giving the player more choice is also something you can consider.
Thank you, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we also have another question in the chat. I think, yeah, I think the first one is also that you said that we should have a dashboard. So because most of the people here is like the small indie team, they don't have dedicated analytics team. So is using Google Play Store dashboard and Firebase is enough as a KPI,
Yes.
core KPI?
Yes, for sure. Google Play, the Google Play dashboard is quite powerful. You know, we always add new features. We're always trying to update it with new things for developers. It can be quite intimidating to learn, just being honest. But it just takes experience, right? I mean, anyone can go in and kind of click around and look at the different metrics, things like that. So I do really highly encourage you to take some time to kind of explore the dashboard. And it doesn't have to be all at once. So, you know, you can focus on one tab or one section for like a day or a week, and then slowly move through the different parts of the dashboard. If you try and learn everything at once, it's definitely probably too overwhelming. So I would say take your time, and the more that you spend time with the dashboard, the more familiar you'll be, and you'll be able to understand your game performance in a much better way.
Okay, yeah. Awesome. Okay, I think, yeah, we also want to ask. So yeah, you're saying that we also have like there's like two kind of paid, right? The three ads, yeah, in-app purchase and the subscription. So I think the question is that which one for the game assets in the game should be on the ads? Which one is the IAP, so they don't like cannibalize between each other?
Yeah, it's really
Any
up to your
kind of
game
guideline?
design. Yeah, it's really up to your game design. I mean, what we find is that the games that really have high amount of IAP revenue tend to have kind of less ads, and vice versa. So it really depends. Like, do you think that your game works best in terms of providing options to players in the form of IAP, or do you think that players would rather watch an ad? It's really hard to say without knowing exactly what type of game you have. But it's also something you can experiment with. That's also something we really encourage developers to do, because honestly, we don't have all the answers either in terms of what makes a hit game. But what we can say is that the developers who do really, really well with monetization are the ones who are always testing, always making sure that they're trying to find out, more optimal ways for their players to engage with their games. So I would say, just try to test different things and see what works best.
Okay. Yeah, we also have a question from Danendra. So is using in-app purchase for removing ads is still a good strategy for monetization?
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely still seen a lot of successful developers who have that. There tend to be the games that are more kind of casual based. So as I mentioned, games that are casual tend to have kind of lower engagement. So a lot of those games make the bulk of their revenue from ads, but then having kind of IAPs remove ads is also like a successful way that they can make the player feel a little bit more invested in the game, so that they actually spend their own money. So yeah, I think it's definitely a valid strategy.
Okay. Yeah. Also, if anyone want to ask, you can raise hand, right, guys? Okay, so I will ask another question from Akasa Prahara from Gigersan. So some developer use subscription model to get revenue. So he want to ask your perspective, opinion of using subscription as a revenue.
Yeah, subscriptions is definitely a growing kind of monetization that we see. So, with subscriptions, it's basically you're asking the player to, commit to your game for a longer period. But basically for a lower amount of money, when you think about it on average. So basically the player gets some benefit of, they can pay a little bit per month to get a certain amount of benefits. Whereas if they were to pay separately through an IAP or something, they might spend more, but it's like a one-time purchase, right? So I think what you need to think about when you think about implementing subscription subscription monetization is kind of what's the long-term benefit that you're giving to the player, and how are you communicating it to them in the game? Because with IAPs, I mean, there are different ways that you can kind of convince the player to buy. Like if you can have sales, or you can do kind of like time gated purchases, things like that. With the subscription, it's really like, hey, we think that you would enjoy this game for a long period of time, so that's why you should pay $1 a month or $2 a month or whatever it is, right? But it really comes back to what we talked about at the beginning, which was like the engagement. So games that don't have high engagement probably won't have success with the subscription model, because to subscribe to something is to really go is to really commit to something in a long-term way from the user perspective. It's not as easy to subscribe to something rather than, as opposed to just buying, an item for one time or two times. So I would say that definitely focus on engagement and kind of providing the value and communicating that value to the user, why they should subscribe rather than just buy an item once, something like that.
I see, get it. Okay. Yeah, hopefully it answered the question from Akasa. If you're not satisfied, you can raise your hand. Okay. Next, we have a question from Lesman. So, what is your opinion about the pay-to-win in-app purchase design? So, is it like a good way to earn a lot of income for new developer? The pay-to-win.
Yeah, this one is quite quite interesting. I think there's different ways to think about it. If we go back to how we thought about the core game loops and kind of like the different stacking of loops on top of it, the pay to win is kind of something that is for games that have like a competitive loop, right? So if your game has some kind of competitive aspect where the players are competing against each other, be it leaderboard or PvP aspect, it can be quite lucrative. So you can make money from it because, in games where people get competitive, people love to spend money to beat other players. Like people just like to win. People don't like to lose. The problem with this is that it's not necessarily sustainable, because it makes the player community get quite upset when they know that that the game outcome can be determined by money instead of like the skill at playing the game. So I think it's a very fine line. We don't really encourage it from Google Play perspective, because we think that it's better to have games that are more long-term engaging. It's more sustainable business for you. If you implement a game that's very pay to win, you might make a lot of money in a short amount of time, but your game might, like the players might get mad, they might leave, and then you'll be left with nothing in the end. So we would rather that developers build games that have competitive aspects where you can spend money to maybe help with progression, but not really pay to win, as in affecting like the competitive balance of the game. What we've seen a lot of companies do that have kind of competitive aspects as the main part of their game is like they monetize the cosmetics. So they monetize things that don't have to do with the actual gameplay balance. So maybe you can buy skins or items that dress up your character but don't affect the gameplay. And that's still another way for players to kind of engage with, winning by showing off that they have the coolest looking character, right? That's another way that players can win, quote unquote. So I would encourage you to think about that, rather than just having like a flat out pay to win IAP design. It's just not too sustainable, in my opinion.
Yeah. So the conclusion is that it's not sustainable, right? It's good for on the short term, but not for long term. Okay.
Yeah.
We also have a question about that. You're saying about that some games usually have bigger in-app purchase than the ads, and the one with the more ads will have less in-app purchase, right? So the question is that, is it like the choose only one, like you either go in-app purchase or ads, or is it possible that you can do both and you can balance between the two kind of monetization, so you can get a lot of ads and in-app purchase also. So is it the
I definitely think it's possible to balance the two. And I see, like the question about cannibalization. I mean, that's definitely something that is definitely possible. But I would say, like, when you design your game and your game economy, and this depends on, like, every game is different, but you should think about which assets and which in-game content do you want to be available via ads, and then which one do you want to be available via IAP, and then don't mix the two together. So if you are offering, like, say, like extra lives for watching an ad, then maybe for IAP you would offer items or cosmetics, things like that. So that's one way you can try to split it to make sure that you don't cannibalize by offering different assets with ads and via IAP.
Okay, yeah, I think that's just okay. The next question is I think about the price, right? Because how do you set the price for the assets to be optimal so it's not too expensive that people doesn't buy, but it's not too cheap to reduce the revenue for us, right? What is the common approach?
Yeah, so I think
price?
the first one is you have to decide what market are you looking at. I think that's kind of like really important, because we know that players in different markets have different wallet sizes. So players in the US might be willing to spend more money than players in Indonesia or Vietnam, things like that. So where you think your main market is quite important. And I would say, definitely look at competitor titles. So we always encourage benchmarking at Google Play. In the Google Play console, you can find kind of benchmark stats for different genres as well. So that should be something you take a look at. But definitely, do some research. Play some games that are similar to yours that you feel like in terms of genre or business model, and see how they price their items, like see how they design their games. There's nothing wrong with kind of copying best practices from other titles, as long as you have your own original idea. So it's important that you try to learn from the players who are already in the marketplace. So if you find that there's a competitor title who's charging a certain price for different items, things like that, you can definitely use that as like a starting baseline in your own title. And then from there, we definitely encourage, again, going back to like testing. So trying to test different prices of IAPs, creating different bundles, servicing them at different times, and then having those be at different price points as well is something that we really encourage, because it's not like a one-size-fits-all approach. Depending on who your player is, what their motivations are, and how engaged they are in the game, there's going to be different price points which they're willing to pay for certain content. So yeah, test for sure. Do research and just try to find that starting point, and then from there try to optimize.
Okay. So anyone, if you want to ask, you can raise hand. Okay. I also, so in the GameSeed program, we have a lot of the team is the freemium model, but there's also some kind of some team that is more suited to the premium model, I think, but on the mobile. So what do you think about that in terms of the purchase, right? So maybe they can buy chapter instead to unlock chapter instead of the buying the assets. So what is the best practice to implement the monetization for this kind of game, right?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, premium monetization is also definitely an option. So yeah, doing things like offering the first level for free, and then having an unlock via IAP to then get the rest of the item or the levels is definitely a way. You could have the game just be upfront, having a price. But so I would say like premium is nice because you can kind of, it's very clear, right? The player wants to play your game, so they buy your game, and then that's kind of like the end of the transaction. What we find is that premium can be quite difficult because there are so many free options in the marketplace. Mobile gaming has a lot of free games, so unless you have a really strong value that you can kind of communicate to the player before they purchase, it might be difficult for them to suddenly just pay you upfront for your game when there are free alternatives and competitors out there. So I definitely think like the idea of having it free to play or free to download at least and free to try and then having like an unlock be behind some kind of paywall is one approach. But yeah, it definitely depends on like how you design your game and how the economy of the game works.
Is there a kind of some kind of guidance for like the I think the most of the one here is using like the free first level, and then the rest is the paywall content, right? So is there like some kind of logic when yeah optimizing the revenue for this kind? Because yeah, we're also using the reference of Monument Valley, I think, right? Monument Valley also have this kind of monetization. So yeah, what do you think about that? Like, is that like the advice for the team who are going
Yeah,
to
I
be?
mean, so if you take the approach of kind of like free to download and then maybe one level and then the rest is like an unlock via the kind of unlock via like an IAP that unlocks the rest of the game. I think what you would really want to do is make sure that that first experience that you give the player is really optimal and really communicates the value of the game. So whatever you give them for free really needs to be a complete snapshot of the whole game offering, even if you don't give them access to all of the different features, because that's the moment when they have to decide, like, am I going to invest more in this game and pay for it, or am I just going to like drop it, right? Because at that point, there's no more content for them to experience because they're just playing like a snapshot. So really having that slice of the game needs to be really strong. And then I would also say like connecting like what the players has done in that slice to the rest of the game is also important. So showing them like, so you played the first chapter, but once you play the rest of the chapters, you can do, you know, XYZ additional things, and it connects in that way. I think having that kind of tied together aspect is pretty important. And then it's not to say like you can also offer additional IAP purchases beyond that. You could also implement ads as well. So you can really kind of make a hybrid approach to your game, depending on like how you want to design it and how you design the economy. But yeah, it's definitely possible to kind of mix and match the different monetization methods.
Okay, so yeah, I think so. The question is that you use the free title, the free level as a snapshot, right? So people knows what they expect, so they are willing to spend. I think that makes sense. Okay, I think the next question is like we used to see like in a lot of games like the promo or discount, yeah, a lot of discount session, etc. So, what do you think about that, and how can is that like the guideline for using it to the game to help the monetization, or is it like the pitfalls?
You mean like
Using,
promo or discount on IAPs or like?
yeah. This
Yeah,
one on IAP, right? Because yeah, the price is like half, right? So we have got half revenue. So what do you think about?
Yeah. So sales and that kind of promotional content can be quite powerful, but at the same time, it is kind of like a reduction in the amount of revenue you bring. But so I think what we always want to do is we want to get. So when we going back to thinking about primary monetization and secondary monetization. So if you think about the secondary monetization as like, yeah, how well are you getting players, or so players who are spending, how much money are you getting out of them? And then primary is of all of your players, how much percentage are actually paying for your game. So I think in games, in markets that have kind of like low purchasing power or markets that don't spend a lot of money, having a kind of a wider base might be more beneficial. So what I mean is that if I could have, this is for an example, if there were 10 players, if my game had 10 players, it might be better to have all 10 players pay $1 rather than have one player pay $10. Like it's technically the same thing, but I think what we really want to do is establish that connection with the players to make them feel comfortable paying in the first place. Because once they open their wallet and feel engaged enough to spend on your game, they're going to be more likely to stick with you for a long time. Because in the example where only one player is paying, the other 9 might just uninstall or leave at some point, right? You never know. But if you can get all of your players in this example, to pay $1, you know that you'll have a community of 10 players who are talking with each other, sharing tips, things like that. There's much more you can do in terms of like building a long-term business if you can have more players highly engaged in your game. So even if they're spending less money, that's actually a better thing for you in the long run. So I think you should think about sales and promotions in that way. So basically you're giving a discount on your IAPs, but that can potentially let someone who wouldn't pay for the full price at least like invest something, and then that can get their foot in the door, and then you can potentially monetize them with more expensive items later. But it's really important to get that initial spend is pretty important. And the other thing I would say for sales is that try not to have them be too predictable, because I think that's another problem that can happen. So if you have like a monthly sale that happens like every time in the middle of the month we have a sale, 50% discount, then the players just wait for the middle of the month to spend their money, and then the rest of the time they don't spend anything. But if you have sales that are kind of more surprise, kind of more unpredictable, that can create more incentive for players to buy in that moment, because they don't know when the next sale is going to happen. So I think that kind of thinking is also quite important, to try to keep your player base on their toes, and really create that kind of time pressure, because then it becomes like, okay, there's a sale now, and I don't know when the next sale is coming, so I better buy whatever item I want. And that really creates more pressure for the player to kind of make a decision and get involved. So I think using sales smartly in that kind of way can be quite effective in building your primary monetization base and again getting more revenue in the long term. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. We also have. I think it's very insightful. Next, we have also a question from Yoga from Redren. So, how do we set the KPI for the game? Like you're saying, like the primary KPI, the secondary. Is that like the realistic way to set KPI?
Yeah, so the core KPIs that I shared in this session are applicable for all games basically that are free to play, even premium to some degree, right? So like understanding how many players in your user base are paying, how much the paying users are paying, what's your conversion rate of non-buyers to buyers, what's your daily active users. These are things that are very core, and it doesn't matter what type of game you're making. We would always monitor these same metrics. So I would say like get comfortable with these primary metrics, the core metrics. And then from there, right, there's probably more specific KPI that your game has. So if your game is like a cooking game or something like that, right? And and one of the assets is number of chefs that the player has. Like that would be a very specific KPI for your game, which is like monitoring the amount of chefs that the player has. I'm just giving an example, right? But I'm saying like the larger core KPIs are definitely something that all games should be looking at.
Okay. So I think for Yoga, if it's not really clear, you can also raise your hand. I think the question is that for the beginner, you can just use the template KPI like the DAU, ARP, DAU, right? Yeah, instead of going too much detail onto the secondary. Okay. Next, we have question from Suherman. When we use promotion week, does Google also boost our app in audience view? Yeah, maybe Suherman, can you clarify the question? Is it like the get the feature? Yeah, I think he's on mute. Maybe can you help answer? So if you are using the promotion in the Google, is there will Google also boost the app like in the store or to the audience, so you can get more exposure?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it depends what you mean by promotion. So if you're talking about Google Play featuring, then yes. So developers for new games can apply for Google Play featuring. There is a form, I believe, that you can fill out. But yeah, if you apply for featuring and then the featuring is accepted and your game passes all of the different requirements, then yeah, Google Play will boost visibility for that new app in the store. Yes.
So Herman, is it clear enough, or do you want to clarify question? Or do we have another question? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so we have 1 more minute. Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay, so I think from Herman, the question is, wait, are you still there? Then oh yeah, sorry, I'm losing. Yeah. Okay, so from the Suherman, is that like if you are getting the premium ad and you get the sales for the price, will it also show up in the featuring, or does Google also boost the visibility for premium app that have the sales of its price?
Okay, that's a good question. I don't believe there's promotion just for discounts on a premium game. So that being said, I think, yeah, but there is the featuring for new games. So as long as your game is a new title and you apply for featuring, whether it's premium or free to play, as long as you pass that featuring request, then you can get boosted. But it won't happen just because of like a price cut.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Hopefully it's clear, right, for Suherman? Okay. So we already finished our session. So thank you, Dan, for all the insight. We can give applause for Dan. Thank you for your time. Okay. And then I will give back to Yusuf.
Thank you.
Hopefully everyone here learned something. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan, for giving us this lesson for today's training session of GAMESEED Incubation. We hope that this is going to be useful for all team that participate in this incubation program. Dan buat Friendship, next training session besok, Kamis tanggal 20 Juli di jam 7 malam sampai jam 8 malam. Seperti biasa, kita akan ngebahas soal how to create effective marketing ad dengan Mert Orhun Simek, co-founder and CMO at Apps, sebagai speaker kita. Oke, sampai ketemu lagi. Terima kasih atas partisipasinya, Friendship. Dadah. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you everyone.
For
Thank you, Dan.
participating. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.